Why did a Texas judge completely black out the media from one of the most explosive murder trials in the state's history? While the internet was flooded with fake rumors and extreme public bias, the absolute truth was hidden behind heavily guarded courtroom doors. District Judge John Roach Jr. completely banned all live streaming, news cameras, and audio recorders from the Collin County courthouse. He made it clear that the justice system is not a reality television show. But what was hidden inside the restricted stadium surveillance footage that the public never got to see? Why did the jury take less than 3 hours to hand down a 35-year murder sentence? The camera ban wasn't just a simple rule. It was a highly calculated legal shield to protect a terrified pool of teenage witnesses, secure the trial's mechanics, and insulate a verdict that is now heading straight into a brutal appellate battle. Let's look at the unbending facts. If you want the real truth behind cases like this, hit subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases right now. Let's dive into what really happened today. When District Judge John Roach Jr. of the 296th District Court issued the total blackout of media cameras and live streams inside the Collin County Courthouse, the decision sparked a massive wave of public pushback from transparency advocates and online observers. People wanted to see inside. They wanted to watch it all unfold. However, according to official court transcripts and judicial mandates, the judge's order was rooted in strict procedural realities, designed to anchor the trial to the law rather than public sentiment. Judge Roach explicitly stated that his primary goal was to ensure both the defendant, 19-year-old Karmelo Anthony, and the prosecution received a fair and impartial trial. He utilized his statutory authority to limit the scope of external influence, recognizing that cameras inherently alter the behavior of lawyers, witnesses, and observers. When you really step back and look at it, you have to think about the human lives at the absolute center of this room. We are talking about a devastating tragedy. Austin Metcalf was just 17 years old. He was a high school student, a kid at a track meet with his whole life ahead of him. His life was cut short in a flash of violence, leaving his parents and his twin brother to navigate an unimaginable grief. The Metcalf family had to sit in that Collin County courtroom every single day. They had to listen to the police reports, look at the evidence, and watch the legal system process the loss of their son. They did this without the shield of a camera lens, sitting directly in the heavy, quiet reality of a closed room. Wow. You can only imagine the kind of strength it takes. And on the other side of the aisle, you had Karmelo Anthony's parents, who publicly stated, according to verified reports, that this was a tragic situation where nobody wins. Two families completely shattered, sitting rows apart. The first major procedural anchor for this media blackout was the absolute insulation of minor witnesses. We have to go back to the day of the incident, April 2nd, 2025. According to police reports, this fatal altercation took place during a high school track meet at Memorial High School's Kuykendall Stadium in Frisco. It started raining. There was a rain delay, and students naturally rushed to find shelter under the team tents. Because of where and how this happened, the police said the vast majority of the key witnesses to the altercation were teenagers. Some were just 15 or 16 years old. The court ruled that broadcasting the names, faces, and live testimonies of these minors to millions of internet viewers would subject them to extreme harassment. I see why the judge drew a hard line here. If you think about being a teenager, stepping up to a witness stand in a highly publicized murder trial is already terrifying. You have prosecutors asking you pointed questions, and you have defense attorneys rigorously cross-examining your memory of a chaotic fight. The court recognized that if these kids knew their faces were being live-streamed on YouTube and clipped on TikTok, it would fundamentally alter their testimony, right? The fear of digital intimidation is very real. In a case that was already heavily scrutinized across social media platforms, the court noted the severe threat of doxing. People on the internet can be incredibly cruel, and the judge knew that a witness might hold back the truth or change their story just to avoid becoming the target of an online mob. By stripping away the visual broadcast, the court aimed to protect the raw honesty of that real-time testimony. They wanted to ensure that these young students could speak freely about the exact sequence of events without the psychological weight of a global internet audience, analyzing their every word, their every facial expression, and their every hesitation. Furthermore, the camera ban served as a mechanical firewall against jury contamination. The legal system relies entirely on a jury making a decision based strictly on what is presented inside the four walls of the courtroom. But this case had already generated massive digital polarization. According to court observers, there was rampant misinformation and severe racial rhetoric circulating online regarding Anthony, who is black, and the victim, Austin Metcalf, who was white. The internet was creating a narrative completely separate from the actual police evidence. By removing cameras, Judge Roach completely eliminated the possibility of trial clips being aggressively edited and taken out of context. You know how social media algorithms work. A 10-second clip of a lawyer shouting, or a witness crying can go viral in an hour, completely ignoring the hours of vital context that surrounded it. If those clips leaked back into the jury pool, or if unsequestered witnesses saw them on their phones before they testified, the entire trial could be compromised. The defense attorneys argued heavily against the false information surrounding the trial, and the court agreed that a firewall was necessary. The rumors were getting so out of hand that the judge himself had to step in. According to verified court records, rumors started circulating online that Judge Roach had a personal connection to the victim's family. Some people on the internet were claiming the trial was rigged from the start. Judge Roach firmly and publicly denied these claims on the record. He stated directly to reporters that he would not have even recognized Metcalf's father prior to the trial. When the judge has to address internet rumors about his own integrity, you can see exactly why he felt the need to shut the digital doors. The court said the noise outside was threatening the justice inside, but this didn't mean the trial was a secret. The public and the press were still legally allowed to be there. The judge established a strict security perimeter around parts of the courthouse grounds, barring the public and potential demonstrators from gathering in restricted areas to prevent intimidation. To maintain constitutional public access without the chaos of a media circus, the court strictly limited the gallery capacity. This structural limitation forced independent journalists, community members, and even extended family to line up outside the courthouse in the dark. Reports from the scene confirmed people were lining up as early as 2 a.m. just to secure one of the few unreserved physical seats in the gallery. It was a daily lottery for access. If you wanted to know the truth about what Karmelo Anthony did or what Austin Metcalf's final moments were like, you had to physically be there, pass through the metal detectors, sit on the wooden benches, and listen with your own ears. No screens, no edits, no commentary. The absolute physical containment of the proceedings demonstrated the court's priority. The integrity of the verdict far outweighed the public's demand for real-time visual consumption. Judge Roach defended his ruling after the trial concluded. Speaking to the press, the judge said that keeping the cameras out was an easy decision. He said, "I know I made people mad, but I'm not here to make them happy either." He made it clear that he sleeps well at night knowing he followed the law and protected the process. You have to look at this from both sides to truly grasp what was going on. The prosecution needed the camera ban, so their teenage witnesses felt safe enough to recount the tragic loss of their classmate without fear of internet retaliation. The defense also needed this camera ban. Karmelo Anthony's defense team was arguing self-defense. They were arguing that a 19-year-old was shoved and acted out of a sudden terrifying passion to protect himself. For a jury to even consider that defense objectively, they could not be swayed by an angry public that had already convicted Anthony in the court of public opinion. Both the state and the defense, according to the principles of the court, required a sterile environment to find the truth. It is a heavy, difficult reality. A 17-year-old boy went to a track meet and never came home. A 19-year-old young man is now facing 35 years in a state penitentiary. Lives have been permanently altered. And while the public demanded a front row seat to the tragedy, the court said no. The police said the evidence needed to speak for itself. The justice system drew a line in the sand, deciding that the human beings involved in this case deserved a quiet, controlled room to seek the truth, far away from the glaring lights of the media. Because the media ban completely prevented the general public from viewing the exact evidence as it was being presented to the jury, the actual mechanics of this trial remained largely misunderstood by everyone watching from the outside. People were making up their minds based on rumors, tweets, and fast-paced internet commentary. But inside the courtroom, it was a completely different atmosphere. Inside those walls, away from the noise, the core of the prosecution's case rested entirely on validating what truly happened under the Memorial High School team tent during a sudden, unexpected rain delay. The legal burden of proof was incredibly steep. The state didn't just have to prove that Karmelo Anthony held the knife or was involved in the fight. They had to demonstrate to 12 jurors that his use of lethal force was an intentional, non-accidental act that severely exceeded the strict legal boundaries of self-defense. You have to picture the setting to really grasp how quickly this tragedy unfolded. It was a regular high school track meet at Kuykendall Stadium in Frisco. Kids from different schools were everywhere. Parents were sitting up in the bleachers cheering on their kids. Adrenaline was running high, as it always does at these big athletic events. Then, the weather turned, and it started pouring rain. Naturally, everyone scrambled to find shelter. According to the verified police reports and the trial submissions, that chaotic rush to stay dry is exactly how this fatal altercation began. It wasn't some premeditated gang fight. It wasn't a long-standing rivalry or a plan on confrontation. It was simply an argument that escalated over physical space under a temporary team tent. Wow. When you really sit with that, the fact that a young life was lost over something so incredibly trivial is just devastating to comprehend. Student witnesses took the stand one after the other to explain what they saw. When you have teenagers taking the stand in a murder trial, you have to realize the incredible emotional stress they are under. These are kids who were just trying to run a track event, and now they are under oath, trying to recall fractions of a second while lawyers pick apart their memory. They testified that Austin Metcalf and several other students approached Anthony and asked him to leave the area because he did not attend their school. Right. You can easily imagine the tense high school dynamics at play here. It's highly territorial, but it quickly went from a simple verbal disagreement to a physical one. The court unsealed the stadium surveillance footage for the jury, and that video legally established that initial pushing definitely occurred. The camera caught the shove. It caught the tension bringing to physical contact in real time. However, the prosecutors argued a very specific, undeniable point, and the silent video corroborated their stance. They argued that while physical pushing did happen, that pushing did not introduce an armed or lethal threat against the defendant. The prosecution didn't shy away from the fact that there was a scuffle. They acknowledged it. Instead, they brought in a staggering roster of 21 witnesses to explain the scale and the nature of that scuffle. Think about the emotional weight in that quiet room as 21 different people, mostly teenagers who just witnessed their classmate get fatally wounded, sat in that witness chair to recount the trauma. The restricted stadium surveillance footage backed up those teenage witness testimonies much more closely than it backed up the narrative the defense was building. The defense had a monumental task ahead of them. They passionately argued that Anthony was physically cornered under that tent. They told the jury that he was being aggressively taunted, outnumbered, and that he acted out of sudden passion and sheer, blinding terror. They painted a picture of a young man who felt completely trapped by a group of opposing athletes and panicked in the heat of the moment. I see how that narrative makes sense when you think about a chaotic fight in a crowded space. But the prosecution systematically pushed back on that entire theory. They contended that out of those 21 witness testimonies, not a single one legally corroborated the claim that Anthony was entirely trapped or physically unable to retreat from the pushing. They argued he had a clear way out, but chose to escalate the encounter instead. If you haven't subscribed to U.S. Crime Cases, hit that button right now. We promise to always bring you the honest truth behind the headlines. Let's talk about the evidence that really shifted the energy in the room. Central to the state's case was the weapon itself. We aren't talking about a heavy hunting knife or a firearm brought with obvious malicious intent. Trial records indicate that the knife used was a 3.5-inch serrated blade, pulled from a standard, everyday multi-tool. That small detail severely changes the visual of the fight. It means the weapon had to be deliberately drawn, opened, and used in extremely close quarters. To explain the severity of this action, Collin County Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Elizabeth Ventura took the stand. This is always the hardest part of any trial for the families involved. Having to sit there just feet away from the jury and listen to the clinical, cold breakdown of how your loved one died is an unimaginable burden. The medical examiner's testimony wasn't just a brief moment in the trial. It was a grueling, detailed presentation of facts that left the courtroom in absolute silence. You could hear a pin drop. Dr. Ventura outlined the fatal injury for the court and confirmed that the wound was not survivable. Wow, it just takes your breath away to hear it described so scientifically when you know a 17-year-old boy's life ended in that exact split second. The prosecution heavily utilized this devastating medical data to anchor their final argument. They firmly stated that the injury was not a panicked scratch or a frantic defensive flail. They argued it was a volitional, intentional act of lethal force that required conviction. Throughout all of these intense, emotionally draining proceedings, Karmelo Anthony sat quietly at the defense table. He exercised his Fifth Amendment right and chose not to take the stand in his own defense. In the eyes of the law, the judge gives very strict, unbending instructions that this constitutional silence absolutely cannot be used to infer any guilt by the jury. It is a fundamental right that every citizen holds. Strategically, however, it completely changed the atmosphere of the jury's deliberation. It meant that the jury never got to hear a personal, verbal explanation of fear directly from Anthony himself. They never got to look him in the eyes and hear him say the words, "I was terrified they were going to hurt me." Without his voice on the record, the defense had absolutely nothing to counter the hard, objective medical data and the unforgiving, silent surveillance video. Instead of hearing from Anthony on the stand, the jury had to evaluate his state of mind entirely through the police incident logs from the day of the track meet. And what was written in those logs was incredibly significant to the outcome. According to the official records, immediately upon his arrest, Anthony stated to the responding officers, "I did it. Is he okay?" When you hear that, it breaks your heart a little bit because it genuinely shows immediate human regret. He clearly wanted to know if the boy survived the altercation. But from a strict legal perspective, legal experts monitoring the procedural flow noted that this immediate, unprompted admission established his full knowledge of the physical act. By clearly stating, "I did it," he structurally dismantled his defense team's ability to claim that the stabbing was just a completely accidental or involuntary reflex that happened in the dark, confusing shuffle of the tent. He knew he used the blade, and he knew he made contact with another person. Recognizing this massive legal hurdle, the defense utilized a dual theory matrix to maintain their ground in the courtroom. The defense lawyers did everything they could to slow down the prosecution's momentum. They cross-examined the police officers, they pointed out the pure confusion of the rain delay, and they asked the jury to put themselves in the shoes of a teenager surrounded by people he didn't know. They fiercely maintained that Anthony was aggressively pursued and that his actions, while undeniably fatal and deeply tragic for everyone involved, were a legally proportional response to being physically mobbed by multiple opposing athletes. They systematically presented this self-defense argument to the jury, hoping to show that in those few chaotic seconds, he truly believed he had no other choice to protect himself. So after the defense systematically presented that self-defense argument to the jury, hoping to show that in those few chaotic seconds, Karmelo Anthony truly believed he had no other choice to protect himself, the trial shifted into its most critical phase. The lawyers packed up their notes, the closing arguments ended, and the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed. The jury was sent back to deliberate. This is always the most agonizing part of any trial. You have two families sitting out in the hallway or waiting in separate rooms, watching the clock tick. The Metcalf family, living with the unimaginable reality that their 17-year-old son, Austin, was never coming home, and the Anthony family, terrified that their 19-year-old son was about to be locked away for the rest of his adult life. It is an incredibly heavy, quiet tension. You just sit there and wait for 12 strangers to decide the absolute truth of what happened that rainy afternoon at the track meet. A lot of onlookers, especially those following the case through the media and online, questioned what happened next. They wondered why the Collin County jury took less than 3 hours to return a guilty verdict for first-degree murder. Right, less than 3 hours. In a case that was so heavily, intensely debated in the court of public opinion. A 3-hour deliberation feels incredibly fast to people on the outside. But the speed of this deliberation didn't come from a rush to judgment. According to legal experts analyzing the trial, the speed lies strictly in the exact legal definitions provided by the court prior to the jury's isolation. You see, the jury didn't just walk into that back room and ask each other how they felt. They were handed a very strict set of rules. Under the Texas Penal Code, the law makes a massive distinction between manslaughter and murder. A charge of manslaughter requires a finding of recklessness. Basically, it means the court said the defendant consciously disregarded a substantial risk, acting wildly without necessarily meaning to kill. In contrast, first-degree murder requires the state to prove that the defendant knowingly or intentionally caused the death of another human being. When the jury sat down, they had to look at the evidence, the unsealed stadium surveillance footage, the medical examiner's report, and the police logs, and apply it to those two definitions. The prosecution argued that using a 3.5-inch serrated blade in that confrontation was not reckless. It was intentional. But the biggest factor that led to that fast verdict was District Judge John Roach Jr. and the specific instructions he gave to the jury before they left the room. Judge Roach provided explicit, unbending judicial directions regarding the statutory framework of self-defense. He had to clarify the specific legal threshold for the jury so they wouldn't be swayed by emotion. The judge instructed them that under the law, an individual absolutely cannot legally claim self-defense if they respond to ordinary physical pushing or a verbal dispute with lethal force. Wow. When you hear that legal instruction, you can start to see exactly why the jury moved so quickly. The judge's instructions regarding what constitutes an unprovoked escalation or a disproportionate response ensured that the jury remained entirely focused on the statutory proportionality of the weapon's use. Basically, the court said you cannot bring a deadly weapon into an unarmed shoving match and claim you were just defending yourself. Of course, the defense fought this fiercely. Before the jury retired to deliberate, Anthony's defense attorneys formally objected to the specific wording in the judge's self-defense charge. They argued on the record that the judge's instructions placed an unfair burden of retreat on the defendant. The defense firmly stated that the instructions completely failed to account for a cornered suspect. They wanted the jury to consider what it feels like to be surrounded under a team tent by opposing athletes, arguing that the law needs to account for the sheer terror of that specific moment. The court heard this objection, but Judge Roach officially overruled it. However, because the legal system relies on a very strict paper trail, this objection was preserved specifically for the appellate record. That means the defense made sure it was written down in the official transcripts so that a higher court could review it later. But for this specific jury in this specific courtroom, they were bound by the instructions on proportional force that the judge provided. Following those strict guidelines, the jury concluded that the introduction of a 3.5-inch blade against unarmed pushing met the absolute criteria for an intentional act of murder. They returned a rapid, unanimous, guilty verdict. Shortly after, the court handed down a massive 35-year prison sentence. When that verdict was read, you have to remember the human beings in that room. The police said the courtroom was heavily guarded, but you can't guard against the emotional devastation of a moment like that. Austin Metcalf's family finally had legal closure, and according to reports, they stated they had forgiven Anthony but believed the 35-year sentence was justified. On the other side of the room, Anthony's parents watched their teenager get handcuffed and taken away, stating publicly that this is a tragedy where nobody wins. I see that. It is just a profound, heartbreaking loss all around. Two young men's lives erased in a matter of seconds over a meaningless argument about space under a tent. Now, as this case transitions out of the trial phase and moves directly into the appellate phase, things are going to get very complicated. The trial's strict containment strategies and the judge's statutory interpretations will face a rigorous, microscopic review by higher courts. The defense's appellate briefs will focus heavily on everything we've talked about. They will challenge whether the jury selection process was fair, whether the evidentiary rulings were balanced, and most importantly, whether the exact wording of those self-defense instructions was handled correctly by Judge Roach. But at the absolute center of this appeal will be the camera ban. The higher courts will have to decide if Judge Roach's unprecedented decision to completely black out the media and ban courtroom cameras was a lawful protection of teenage witnesses or an overreach of judicial power. There is actually a broadcast circulating right now where Judge Roach offers an inside look at the Karmelo Anthony trial. In this broadcast, the judge openly discusses his strict courtroom rules and the intense public pressure that surrounded the trial. He stands by his choices, reiterating that his only job was to protect the integrity of the law, not to feed the media's desire for content. This entire procedural reality leaves us with some incredibly critical, fact-based questions. We are looking at the intense intersection of public transparency, constitutional law, and the strict mechanics of the justice system. I really want to know what you think about how this was handled because it affects how our entire legal system operates. First, let's talk about the witness protection versus public access dilemma. District Judge John Roach Jr. banned all live cameras specifically to protect a heavily minor-age teenage witness pool from public exposure and social media pressure. The court said the threat of doxing was too high. Do you believe a trial judge should have the absolute statutory authority to black out a trial to safeguard minor witnesses? Or does a total camera ban compromise the public's fundamental right to transparent justice? It is a tough balance. Second, consider the logic of the fast-track jury deliberation. This Collin County jury took less than 3 hours to return a first-degree murder conviction based on stadium surveillance video and the defendant's immediate post-arrest admission to the police. From a strict legal standpoint, does a rapid verdict prove that the evidence of intent was entirely definitive, or should high-profile trials require a more extended deliberation process to guarantee a truly exhaustive review of a young man's self-defense claims? And finally, we have to look at the burden of the self-defense instruction itself. As we discussed, the defense formally objected to Judge Roach's specific wording regarding the self-defense boundaries under that team tent, arguing it restricted the jury's view of a cornered suspect acting out of fear. In your opinion, do strict statutory definitions of proportional force protect our communities from escalating violence, or do they place an unfair, unrealistic legal burden on an individual who is caught in a chaotic, terrifying physical confrontation? These aren't easy questions, and there are no simple answers. It is a devastating case that forces us to look closely at how the truth is found behind closed doors and how the justice system tries to weigh human tragedy against the cold, hard letter of the law. Thank you so much for staying till the end. If you appreciate honest, fact-based storytelling without the rumors, please hit subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases. See you next time.